These acts are outside known frameworks, so far beyond youthful malice.
They look at me. They see a boy, a broken toy, a mistake of nature.
Emotion. Such a fragile variable. So easy to manipulate.
The premeditated murders of your parents, Margaret and Robert Arnold. This court sentences you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole.
For the crimes of which you have been found guilty, this court sentences you to a death, yeah. He said, death. In a quiet Oklahoma courtroom, the defendant facing the ultimate penalty wasn't a hardened serial killer or a notorious gang leader. He wasn't even a legal adult. The defendant, now facing lethal injection, was a child. A boy just 10 years old. How did we get to this impossible point? How does a justice system arrive at a place where it decides the only solution is to execute a fourth grader? To answer that horrifying question, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to a quiet, modest home on Willow Creek Drive. A home that was supposed to be a sanctuary, but instead became the bloody stage for one of the most unsettling and profoundly disturbing cases in the history of criminal violence in Oklahoma. In the Arnold family home, the walls were lined with picture-perfect family photos. Smiling faces in frames, capturing domestic bliss, frozen moments in time that gave no indication, no hint, of the horror that was about to unfold behind those closed doors. If you're watching this, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of true crime cases that challenge our understanding of human psychology. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this case in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. And now, back to the unfolding tragedy of the Arnold family and the events that would shake the foundations of Oklahoma's criminal justice system. On the morning of August 9, 2018, at 6:32 a.m., emergency services received a frantic call. It wasn't from inside the Arnold home, but from the next-door neighbor, Ellen Simmons. She had responded to panic knocking at her door, only to find 9-year-old Dakota Arnold standing there, dressed in blood-spattered pajamas, apparently hysterical, and barely able to communicate that something horrible had happened to his parents. The dispatcher instructed her to keep the boy at her home while officers were dispatched to the address. Officer Daniel Rodriguez was the first to arrive on the scene. What he found in the master bedroom was something from a horror film. The couple, Margaret and Robert Arnold, had been brutally murdered in their bed. The room was a scene of carnage, with blood spatter covering the walls and ceiling. They had both suffered multiple traumatic injuries, inflicted with significant force. Medical examiners would later determine the deaths occurred in the dead of night, between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., while both victims were asleep. They were given no chance to defend themselves against the calculated attack that ended their lives. When additional investigators arrived, they found young Dakota at the neighbor's house. Later, in his own bedroom, they found him huddled in a corner, apparently in deep shock, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. There were traces of blood on his pajamas, which he claimed came from discovering his parents and desperately trying to wake them. Through his tears, Dakota spun a story. A terrifying tale of hearing noises in the night, creeping from his bed, and finding his parents already dead. But then, the 9-year-old boy offered a critical lead. He pointed investigators toward his best friend, Tyler Wilson. Dakota claimed Tyler had been angry with his parents because they hadn't allowed him to stay overnight the previous weekend. At first glance, the story seemed plausible, if tragic. A traumatized child who had witnessed the aftermath of a terrible crime committed by someone else, perhaps an intruder, or as he suggested, his disgruntled friend. But as the first 24 hours of the investigation unfolded, inconsistencies began to emerge in Dakota's account. Small discrepancies at first, but enough to raise quiet concerns among the experienced detectives assigned to the case. Detective Melissa Taylor, a 15-year veteran of the Oklahoma City Police Department with specialized training in crimes involving juveniles, was assigned to lead the case. She was joined by her partner, Detective Jason Barnes, who had recently transferred from the Auto Theft Division, a specialty that would, unexpectedly, become central to the case. They approached the initial interview with Dakota with extreme caution, mindful of his age and the potential trauma he had experienced. But as Dakota recounted his version of events for the third time, Detective Barnes noted subtle changes. Changes in the timeline, in the details, especially regarding when he claimed to have last seen Tyler Wilson and the specific sequence of discovering his parents' bodies. The inconsistencies were minor, the kind one might expect from a child in shock. But something about Dakota's composure, his calmness under the surface, struck Detective Barnes as unusual. It triggered those instincts he had developed over years of interrogating suspects who were hiding something. Meanwhile, the crime scene team was taking the Arnold house apart, piece by piece. And Dakota's story was rapidly falling apart. Red flag number 1. The Arnold home, a modest 4-bedroom house, had not been broken into. All doors and windows were secure from the inside. This immediately suggested the perpetrator either had a key or, for more chillingly, was already inside the home when the murders took place. Red flag number 2. The murder weapons. They were identified as a hammer and a box cutter, taken from Robert Arnold's own set of work tools. But they weren't left at the scene. They were found cleaned and returned to the garage toolbox. This was an unusual level of evidence remediation. It immediately raised huge red flags among the investigative team. What kind of intruder, or what angry 9-year-old friend, would take the time to meticulously clean and store the murder weapons before fleeing the scene of a massacre? Red flag number 3. The microforensics. Forensic technicians, processing the master bathroom, noted unusual water spatter patterns around the sink, suggesting a recent cleanup. More importantly, they found faint bloodstains in the drain that hadn't been completely washed away. And in the garage, near the toolbox, microscopic blood droplets were found on the floor, suggesting the perpetrator had stood in that very spot while cleaning the weapons before putting them back. These were not the actions of chaos or passion. This was calculated. Oklahoma City was stunned. The quiet Willow Creek Estates community, with its well-kept lawns and community pool, became the epicenter of a media frenzy. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, exchanging shocked whispers about the family they thought they knew. Local schools immediately deployed counselors to help Dakota's classmates process the news, while parents across the city hugged their children tighter. They were suddenly confronted with terrifying questions about what might lurk beneath the surface of childhood innocence. But Detective Taylor, in the midst of this chaos, gave one crucial order: analyze the family computer. It was a standard procedure, but it would yield unexpectedly damning evidence. The technician who examined the browser history made a discovery that radically altered the course of the investigation. The day before the murders, a series of searches had been made on the device. These were not innocent childhood queries. They were: how to avoid leaving fingerprints, can children be tried as adults, and cleaning blood from clothing. The timing was the nail in the coffin. The searches were conducted during school hours. On that specific day, Dakota had claimed to be sick and stayed home from school. His parents, Margaret and Robert, were both confirmed to have been at work at the time. This digital evidence cast an immediate, dark shadow over Dakota's tear-filled story. The focus of the investigation shifted entirely, and unequivocally, toward the 9-year-old boy who had just lost his parents. Or perhaps, more accurately, the boy who had just taken their lives. He had done so with a level of premeditation that shocked even the most seasoned investigators on the case. But the question that hung in the investigation room was, why? Margaret Arnold, as her colleagues remembered her, was a dedicated and nurturing soul. The librarian who made it her mission to help reluctant readers discover the magic of stories. But in her last staff meeting before her death, Margaret had expressed concern to a close colleague. She mentioned that Dakota had become increasingly secretive and resistant to household rules. He was especially resistant to the strict 8 p.m. curfew she and Robert had instituted, after they noticed their son trying to sneak out of the house after they had gone to bed. Robert Arnold was a family man who proudly shared stories of Dakota's intelligence. But he too, in the weeks before his death, had confided in his supervisor about increasing tension at home. He mentioned arguments with Dakota over restrictions on his activities and his computer use. Robert had chalked it up to normal childhood boundary testing, not something more sinister. The truth was immeasurably more sinister. At Willow Creek Elementary School, Dakota was described as an intelligent student who excelled academically. But he struggled with peer relationships and authority figures. Just 2 weeks before the murders, his third-grade teacher, Ms. Williams, had requested a parent-teacher conference. It was about an incident where Dakota had threatened another student, a student who had accidentally damaged a notebook that Dakota guarded closely. The result of this meeting was Dakota losing his computer privileges at home for a week. A punishment, Margaret later told the teacher, that resulted in an explosive tantrum unlike anything they had ever seen from their son before. That notebook was never recovered, leaving questions about what it contained that was so precious to the boy. The parents were worried. They had consulted a family therapist about Dakota's increasing defiance and emotional distance. They were seeking guidance on how to maintain appropriate boundaries. These therapy sessions led to the implementation of a structured behavior management system, including that strict 8 p.m. curfew, where Dakota was required to be in his room with all electronic devices surrendered to his parents until morning. It was this system, this well-intentioned parenting, that sealed their fate. Unbeknownst to them, that curfew was directly interfering with a criminal enterprise their 9-year-old son was running. This is where Detective Jason Barnes's background in auto theft became the key that unlocked the entire case. While examining the family garage, Barnes noticed something odd. Tucked behind a loose wall panel, he discovered a small notebook. This was no kid's diary. It was filled with what appeared to be codes, addresses, and crude maps of residential streets in neighboring communities. Barnes took the notebook and cross-referenced it with recent auto theft reports. What he found stunned him. There was an alarming pattern of luxury vehicle thefts in those exact neighborhoods, all occurring between midnight and 4 a.m. over the previous 6 months. The addresses in Dakota's notebook corresponded precisely with the locations of the stolen cars. Several pages contained notes about security systems, whether dogs were present at the properties, and optimal times for accessing the vehicles. It all suddenly made horrifying sense. The strict 8 p.m. curfew Robert and Margaret were enforcing wasn't just an annoyance to a child. It was directly cutting into the late-night surveillance operations necessary for Dakota's profitable business. A warrant was obtained for Dakota's phone and social media accounts. They discovered communications with his friend, Tyler Wilson. The messages showed no conflict about a sleepover. Instead, they revealed coded references to late-night activities and business. And they revealed that Dakota had been pressuring Tyler to provide him with alibis for several nights when car thefts had occurred. Then came the smoking gun. A message sent from Dakota to Tyler just hours before the murders: "After tonight, no more stupid curfew problems. I'll be free to run things my way." The digital evidence, the notebook, the messages, it all painted a coherent picture of premeditation. The motive was money and power. The parents were an obstacle. The detectives now faced the delicate challenge of interrogating a 9-year-old murder suspect. Under Oklahoma law, the presence of an appropriate adult representative was required. This role was filled by his maternal grandmother, Elaine Winters, who sat stunned and disbelieving as detectives carefully explained that her grandson was now the prime suspect in her daughter's murder. In the interview room, designed to feel less intimidating, Dakota maintained his initial story. His voice was steady, his eyes dry. Detective Taylor used specialized interview techniques. When Taylor gently confronted him with the evidence of his blood-spattered sneakers hidden under his bed, Dakota's demeanor subtly changed. A tightening around the eyes, a slight withdrawal in his posture. Then, he modified his story. He claimed he'd entered his parents' room during the night to ask for water, found them dead, panicked, and hid his shoes because he was afraid of getting in trouble. Then Detective Barnes shifted the questioning toward the auto theft notebook. He watched carefully as Dakota's expression flickered between surprise and calculation at the mention of evidence he hadn't realized had been discovered. When shown photos of the stolen luxury cars, Barnes noted how the boy's eyes lingered on certain vehicles with what appeared to be recognition, even pride. Then came the computer searches. Dakota initially denied them, claiming his parents might have been researching a crime show. But when Taylor proved the searches occurred while they were at work and he had called in sick, Dakota shifted his story again. In a calculated manipulation that disturbed even the seasoned detectives, he suggested that maybe Tyler had come over while he was sick and used the computer. Once again attempting to divert suspicion toward his friend, after nearly 4 hours. With his grandmother sitting in silent shock, Detective Taylor decided to confront the boy with the full narrative they had constructed. She calmly explained that they believed he was running a car theft operation, that his parents' curfew had threatened this criminal enterprise, that he had researched how to commit murder without leaving evidence, and that he had executed his parents before attempting to frame his friend Tyler for the crimes. Taylor watched Dakota carefully. She noted how his expressions shifted between calculation, defiance, and what appeared to be relief at no longer needing to maintain his fabricated story. After a long moment of silence, Dakota asked a question that would be quoted in case files and news reports across the country. "If I tell you what really happened, can I have my notebook back? I need those codes." In the hours that followed, as his grandmother wept silently beside him, Dakota began to confess. With chilling detachment, he described how the car theft operation was his idea, inspired by online videos, and how he had recruited older kids to help with the parts that required physical strength. The business was profitable. But the curfew and the increasing police patrols threatened the entire operation. His parents, with their strict enforcement of the rules, were preventing him from conducting the necessary surveillance. On August 15, 2018, 1 week after the murders, 9-year-old Dakota Arnold was formally arrested. His response to the arrest was unnervingly calm. He asked practical questions about what he could bring with him and whether he would have access to books in juvenile detention. But just as the system was beginning to process this, the story was about to take an even darker turn. Detective Jason Barnes was continuing to follow the auto theft leads. He didn't know that his thorough police work had put him on Dakota's hit list. On August 18, 3 days after Dakota's arrest, Barnes visited a newly discovered storage unit linked to the case. He was working alone. Barnes didn't know that Dakota had prepared contingencies for this exact discovery. He had planted a crude but effective booby trap designed to eliminate anyone who thoroughly examined the back corner of the unit where the most incriminating evidence was stored. The explosion, triggered when Barnes moved a specific container, caused catastrophic injuries that would prove fatal, despite rapid emergency response. The death of Detective Jason Barnes transformed the Arnold case overnight. It added a third murder victim and dramatically escalated the severity of the charges against Dakota. The Oklahoma City Police Department entered a period of mourning for their 15-year veteran, while grappling with the unprecedented reality that his killer was a 9-year-old child currently in juvenile detention. When Dakota was informed of the detective's death in detention, his response was what staff described as inappropriate affect. He asked detailed questions about the mechanism of the explosion and whether it had worked as designed, rather than showing any remorse or surprise. And the most satanic detail of all, forensic analysis of the trap's components revealed fingerprints matching Tyler Wilson. Further investigation revealed that Dakota had manipulated Tyler into handling the components months earlier, under the guise of a science project. He had deliberately planted physical evidence that could implicate his friend if the trap was ever discovered. When confronted with this, Dakota displayed what the transcript described as pride in his thoroughness. He explained, "You have to plan for everything that could go wrong if you want to succeed. In January 2019, silence fell in the Oklahoma County Juvenile Courtroom as Dakota Arnold, now 10 years old, was led in for what would become one of the most controversial trials in state history. The prosecution, led by Andrew Patterson, was methodical. They laid out the case not as a childish act, but as a calculated plan. They showed the digital evidence, the searches, the Freedom Day countdown timer, the horrifying videos of his sleeping parents with his whispered narration about attack angles. They proved the motive, the car theft operation, and how his parents were obstacles to be removed. And they presented the third murder, the booby trap that killed Detective Barnes, as proof that Dakota was capable of forward planning even beyond his own arrest. The defense, led by Rebecca Thornton, didn't argue the facts. How could they? Instead, they argued the mind. They argued they weren't trying an adult criminal, but a deeply disturbed child. They brought in Dr. Eleanor Kaufman, the forensic psychologist. Her diagnosis, conduct disorder with callous and emotional traits, a precursor to adult sociopathy. She testified that Dakota possessed superior intellect, in the 1-for-515 IQ range, but that it was paired with a profound deficit in empathy and emotional processing. Drive. Kaufman argued that while Dakota intellectually understood that murder was wrong, against the law, he lacked the emotional and moral development to comprehend the human significance of ending a life. Then the defense brought in Dr. Marcus Rivera, a neurodevelopmental researcher, using comparative brain scans. He explained to the court that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and moral reasoning, is biologically undeveloped in a 9-year-old's brain. He argued that regardless of IQ, the biological structures for mature judgments simply were not there. They also called Dr. Sarah Thompson, a childhood trauma specialist, who testified that Dakota's early history in the foster care system may have permanently damaged his neural pathways for bonding and empathy. The prosecution was ready to rebut. They argued that Dakota's extensive efforts to conceal evidence, frame his friend, and set traps demonstrated a full awareness that his actions were wrong and would be condemned. They showed his searches about juvenile sentencing guidelines and can children get the death penalty. Why? This wasn't someone who didn't understand wrongness, they argued. This was someone conducting a calculated risk assessment of the consequences. The most devastating moment of the trial was when the prosecution called digital forensics specialist Aidan Walsh. He had recovered deleted journal entries hidden inside a gaming app file on Dakota's tablet. And these entries, written in the weeks before the murders, Dakota outlined his explicit reasoning for eliminating his parents. It included a cost-benefit analysis, listing problems solved by their deaths alongside potential complications to be managed afterward. The entries included notes on how to frame Tyler and how to manipulate police assumptions about child suspects, and the most chilling entry, written the night before the murders: "Tomorrow I become independent. Parents are just temporary caretakers anyway, and mine have become obstacles to my business. I've planned everything carefully, and after tomorrow, no one will be able to tell me when to sleep or where I can go." On March 27, 2019. After 6 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, Judge Harriet Simmons delivered her verdict. Dakota Arnold, 10 years old, was found guilty on all counts, including the first-degree murders of his parents and Detective Jason Barnes. The judge acknowledged the boy's age but ultimately concluded that the evidence of premeditation, concealment, and the booby trap demonstrated a level of intent and awareness that could not be dismissed on the basis of age alone. The sentencing phase began. The prosecution argued for an unprecedented application of the Youthful Offender Act: hold him in juvenile custody until 18, then transfer him to adult prison for the rest of a life sentence. They argued his unique combination of intelligence and lack of empathy created an extraordinary public safety risk. The defense argued passionately against treating him as an adult, proposing a specialized secure therapeutic facility instead. On April 10, 2019, Judge Simmons delivered her decision, one that would ignite a national firestorm. in an unprecedented interpretation of Oklahoma statutes, the judge ruled that the extreme nature of the crimes and the defendant's sophistication warranted treating Dakota Arnold as an adult offender. Despite his age, the judge sentenced Dakota to death for each of the 3 murders. He became the youngest person ever sentenced to capital punishment in Oklahoma history. The judge acknowledged in her ruling that the sentence would face extensive appeal, but stated that the evidence presented a case so far outside normal childhood behavior that existing frameworks were inadequate. The sentence ignited a legal and ethical firestorm. The victims' families themselves were divided. Sarah Barnes, the detective's widow, supported the decision, emphasizing the calculated disregard for human life. In contrast, Elaine Winters, Dakota's grandmother, gave an emotional interview, saying her daughter Margaret would not have wanted her son executed, calling it another tragedy piled onto an already incomprehensible loss and pleading for treatment. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections faced an unprecedented logistical nightmare. They had no facility to house a child on death row. 2 years later, after prolonged legal battles, on June 12, 2021, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals issued a landmark ruling. It overturned the death sentence, citing U.S. Supreme Court precedents like Roper v. Simmons that prohibit the execution of offenders who committed their crimes as juveniles. The court extended this reasoning to conclude that Dakota's age categorically excluded him from capital punishment, regardless of the heinousness of his crimes. The court upheld the murder convictions but sent the case back for resentencing, instructing that any new sentence must provide both appropriate secure confinement and a genuine opportunity for treatment. The case forced the Oklahoma legislature to act. The Margaret Arnold Act was passed, named for Dakota's murdered mother, creating new protocols for early detection in schools and information sharing between educators and mental health providers. As for Dakota Arnold himself, he was eventually housed in a specialized secure facility. He remained an enigmatic figure, growing from a child to a teenager, and eventually to a young adult, within the walls of a system still struggling to figure out what to do with him. Annual evaluations documented his physical growth alongside his psychological assessment, noting progress in certain therapeutic areas but also persistent deficits in emotional empathy. His case remains a chilling reminder that the lines between innocence and guilt, between childhood and criminality, are not always as clear as we'd like to believe. It forced an entire community to ask, what do you do when the monster wears the face of a child?